speaker is an author and journalist. He will be speaking on settler colonialism in Indian-occupied Kashmir and Zionist-occupied Palestine. His forthcoming book is titled Modern-Day Settler Colonialism, Israel and Palestine, India and Kashmir. We also have two of his books on sale here today. The first one is called Empire, Racism, and Genocide, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy, and Propaganda, Lies, and False Flags, How the U.S. Justifies Its Wars. And there's a special conference price today only. You can get both of the books, both of his books, for $20. Please welcome Robert Fantina.
Thank you. Settler colonialism can be defined as an ongoing system of power that perpetuates the genocide and repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. Essentially hegemonic in scope, settler colonialism normalizes the continuous settler occupation, exploiting lands and resources to which indigenous people have genealogical relationships. Settler colonialism includes interlocking forms of oppression, including racism, often white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, close quote. For decades, Israel and India have perpetrated these crimes against the Palestinians and Kashmiris. Is that better? Okay. For decades, Israel and India have perpetrated these crimes against the Palestinians and Kashmiris, respectively. These problems are rooted in United Nations decisions from 1947-1948, and the parallels between those impacting Palestine and those pertaining to Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir are striking. Both India and Israel use suppression of human rights, health terrorism, destruction of property, torture, sexual violence, economic manipulation, and several other methods to repress and marginalize the indigenous populations. Both India and Israel illegally moved their citizens permanently onto occupied lands. Although both the Palestinians and Kashmiris have suffered greatly during the decades since the Security Council set the stage for their oppression, Kashmiri oppression has accelerated greatly since the August 5th, 2019 abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution. This has dramatically increased the suffering of the Kashmiri people, who are being made strangers in their own homeland. The parallels between Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and India's of the Kashmiri people is striking, and it's not coincidental. On November 16th of 2019, just 3 months after the abrogation, Sandeep Chakravarty, India's Consul General in New York City, was in New York attending a private event. He told Kashmiri Hindus and Indian nationals that India will build settlements modeled after Israel for the return of the Hindu population to Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. He did not mince words. He said this, quote, "In your lifetime, you will be able to go back, and you will be able to find security because we already have a model in the world. I don't know why we don't follow it. It happened in the Middle East. If the Israeli people can do it, we can also do it," close quote. During this time of COVID, health terrorism perpetrated against Palestine by Israel and against Kashmir by India has grown. This has increased the suffering of the victim populations who are already deprived of many of the medical advances available to most other nations. In Palestine, temporary hospitals, mainly consisting of tents, established to serve those suffering from COVID, are routinely destroyed by Israel, with the equipment being confiscated. Under international law, an occupying power has an obligation to provide for the health of the occupied people. Pandemic treatment is specifically mentioned in international law. Yet the Israeli government has refused to provide vaccines to the Palestinians, and only late in the pandemic did it offer some vaccines that were near their expiration date. In Kashmir, due to the extremely heavy ratio of foreign soldiers to Kashmiris, Kashmir is the most heavily militarized place in the world, and the soldiers' brutal terrorizing of the citizenry, many people fear leaving their homes to visit medical facilities, even if they are involved in ongoing treatment for diseases such as cancer. The arbitrary arrests of Kashmiris are too great a threat for them to risk leaving their homes. Less than 2 weeks after the August 5th abrogation, a group of doctors raised the alarm. In an August 16th letter in the medical journal BMJ, 19 doctors from across India asked the government to ease restrictions on communication travel, saying they were, quote, "a blatant denial of the right to health care and the right to life," close quote, because they made it difficult for patients and staff to reach hospitals without hindrance. Their request has not been acted on. The people of any nation are entitled to self-determination. Whether or not powerful foreign interests will allow them to have it is another issue. For decades, Israel, and for the last 20 years with the complicity of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, has denied this right to the Palestinians. In 2021, just days before the first election in Palestine in years was scheduled to take place, and for which there was wide enthusiasm, Abbas canceled the election ostensibly because he didn't know if the Israeli government would allow Palestinians living in Jerusalem to vote. United Nations Security Council Resolution 47, which was passed on April 21st, 1948, in that, it said, quote, "The question of the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India or Pakistan should be decided through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite." Close quote. The plebiscite that guarantees self-determination for the Kashmiri people was clearly stated, but has never been allowed to happen, and India has jettisoned any pretense that it ever will. The right of free speech and freedom of press are a hallmark of any functioning democracy. Yet Israel, during its many bombing episodes in Palestine, targets press vehicles and offices, and during the weekly March for the Right of Return, shot journalists who were clearly marked as such. These are all war crimes. Israeli officials routinely arrest and incarcerate journalists in the West Bank and Jerusalem. In Kashmir, independent journalists report facts on the ground at the risk to their lives. The imprisonment and killing of journalists who are not willing to report only what India wants reported has greatly increased since the August abrogation of Article 370. Reporters are hesitant to ask questions, and people in the street are afraid to answer them. In both Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and Palestine, people are arrested by the foreign forces for posting anything on social media seen as critical of either Israel or India. Even an innocuous post by someone who, in the past, has criticized either nation can cause an arrest, even if the post had nothing to do with the occupation or the occupying power. Travel to and from any country is an international right, one that is denied the people of Palestine and the people of Kashmir. Reporters and diplomats with a strong record of support for India's blatant anti-Muslim policies, reporters and diplomats without a strong record of support for India's blatant anti-Muslim policies are forbidden from entering Kashmir. People living in the diaspora with relatives there have an extremely difficult time getting into the country if they're allowed to do so. Economic terrorism is used by both countries. Israel prevents Palestinian farmers from farming their own land. And in Kashmir, the internet blackout imposed by India and lasting more than a year is estimated to have cost the Kashmir economy over $2.5 billion. That's about 10% of the 2018 gross domestic product, which indicates a very significant economic downturn. The people of Palestine and Kashmir have no redress for these crimes. Laws in Israel and India allow their so-called law enforcement officers such wide latitude that they are seldom ever accused of crimes and rarely ever convicted. Indian soldiers in Kashmir are granted almost complete impunity for any crimes, including murder, rape, kidnapping, theft, etc. In Israel, when some egregious crime committed by Israeli soldiers garners so much publicity that the government feels required to make some statement, the spokesperson will say that Israel is performing its own internal investigation. It's not surprising that these investigations almost always determine that the offending soldier acted appropriately, regardless of the crime that he or she has committed. Some governments timidly condemn Israeli actions against the Palestinian people and pay lip service to a two-state solution. They often refer to the issue of Kashmir as an internal Indian problem. International law, specifically the 1907 Hague Regulations and the Fourth Geneva Convention, which define occupation, what it means, its conditions, and the responsibilities of the occupying nation, coupled with Security Council Resolution 46, referenced previously, prove conclusively that Kashmir is not an internal problem of India, that Palestine is not a disputed land, and that the situations in both Palestine and Kashmir constitute severe violations of international law. There are numerous international agreements, including some signed by India, that guarantee self-determination for the people of Kashmir, further exposing the lie of it being an internal Indian problem. As was mentioned earlier, most of the international community has ignored these crimes against humanity, preferring to defer to the economic benefits accrued from not alienating Israel or India. The United States supports all of Israel's crimes against humanity by financing them with nearly $4 billion in aid annually, and with only rare exceptions, vetoing any Security Council resolutions either critical of Israel or supportive of Palestine. U.S. government officials proclaim the shared values between the two nations, and in terms of racism, violations of international law, and suppression of human rights, there may indeed be many shared values. Yet in supporting Israel, the U.S. government is complicit in all Israel's violations of international law. While there has been much discussion for decades about Israeli abuse in Palestine, comparatively little study has been devoted to the parallel situation in Kashmir. A side-by-side comparison, however, clearly demonstrates that the Palestinians and the Kashmiris suffer the same abuses while entitled to the same rights that all people are guaranteed under international law. There can be no question that Israel and India blatantly and consistently violate these rights. It is vital that we continue speaking out for the people of Kashmir and Palestine. We must be their voices because the international community refuses to hear them. We must assure without question that it hears us. Every day is one too many for the suffering to continue. We are the ones who must cause it to stop. It is a daunting task, but one that we cannot shirk. Thank you.